Well, I'm very pleased today to be here with with Professor Pranab Bardhan on the current topic, and our topic is this book. This is a book that we are going to review today, right, in this session. It's titled "A World of Security, Democratic Disenchantment in Region Poor Countries." The issue that we're discussing is the decline of democracy, and that's something that's been documented very well in different indices or studies like, for instance, the VTM report that comes out yearly, or the EU's Democracy Index. It's the phenomenon of rising right-wing leaders and extremism. So our plan would be to start with Professor Bardhan, and before we get there, I will say a few things about Professor Bardhan, because he's a distinguished professor emeritus of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He had a brilliant academic career. He taught at the MIT, he taught at the LA School of Economics, and he taught also he's now joining Berkeley in California. He's been visiting professor at Cambridge, Oxford, and the LSE. He is a prolific writer. He has 17 books published and 16 that he edited. And he has more than 150 articles published in journals. So we're pleased to have him with us. The plan is to give him the podium for a presentation of about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll come back with conversation and questions. Professor Bardhan, over to you.
Thank you very much for those generous remarks. Am I audible to you?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Very well, yes.
Okay. Thanks for those generous remarks. So you want me to talk about my book a little bit, and then we'll take questions. So let me tell you what my book is about. There are many books in the market now about the erosion of democracy that's taking place practically in much of the world. Almost all parts of the world, you will have many examples of erosion of democracy, and certainly in Europe, you see the trend toward right-wing populist demagogues. And there are many books on this erosion of democracy. Let me tell you in what way my book is somewhat different from these other books, in 4 ways. Number one is that my book covers not just Europe and North America, but also developing countries. In many developing countries, the same problem of erosion of democracy or democratic disenchantment, as I mentioned in the subtitle of the book. But I particularly focus on 3 developing countries. One is, of course, my own country, India. Second is Turkey. And a third is Brazil. So those 3 developing countries I give special attention to, but I also talk about other developing countries. So that's number one. Number two is that in much of the discussion, particularly by economists, the general trend has been to relate this phenomenon, political phenomenon, with the gradual rise of inequality in much of the world, economic inequality. Now, I myself am very much concerned about inequality, but my position is that probably is not the major explanation for understanding the erosion of democracy. In fact, otherwise, you will not be able to explain why in many countries, the people who are now voting, the right-wing demagogues, they're rallying under the banner of billionaires sometimes. Trump is a billionaire. Marine Le Pen in France is a billionaire. In UK, and Brexit, one of the original leaders, Nigel Farage, he has assets. He had assets of hundreds of millions of dollars. Then Orban in Hungary is a billionaire. Erdogan in Turkey is a billionaire. Modi in India is not a billionaire, but he's cozy with billionaires. So if workers were really, working classes were really worried about inequality, they wouldn't have rallied under the banner of many of these billionaires or friends of billionaires. So we have to look for other things. The major issue that I focus in my book is insecurity, not inequality. That's the title of the book, A World of Insecurity. The third way my book is somewhat different from the others is that I take the case of China very seriously. Chinese provide an alternative model of authoritarian capitalism, and I show that that is not the right model, even though China has some important points in terms of governance. There are some strong points in terms of governance. I show that those strong points of governance are, for that, authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient. And some of the ugly features of Chinese development have to do with authoritarianism. So in general, I have a long chapter on this Chinese alternative, and I ultimately say this is not the right alternative. And the fourth way my book is different from the others is that half of the book, the first half of the book is on diagnosis of the problems, and the second half of the book is what to do about it. And in that connection, given my own political prejudices and views, I essentially argue for a rejuvenation of social democracy. And in particular, I talk about what to do in terms of concentration of capital, in terms of weak voice of labor, etc. So those are the 4 points of my book's distinction from the other books on erosion of democracy. Now, given the shortness of time, let me mention focus on 2 issues that are very important in my book. The first issue in the first half, diagnosis, the main question with which I start is why, if the issues like inequality or even insecurity that I'm talking about, if these are important issues, these are traditionally left-wing issues. Why are the working classes turning right, not left? So that's a major question that we have to answer. And there I discuss a lot of issues, including the fact that while insecurity to me is very important, but I regard insecurity is not just economic insecurity. Economic insecurity in terms of job losses, income losses, etc., those have been very important. But beyond that, I also emphasize cultural insecurity. And cultural insecurity of various kinds, mostly non-economic insecurities, but particularly, for example, for Europe, one of the cultural issues is immigration, anxiety about immigrants. Now, immigration is of course an economic issue as well, but it's not just the economic aspect of immigration, but I think there's a lot of anxiety about the cultural norms and cultural practices of immigrants. So that's a cultural issue I discuss quite a bit in my book. In developing countries, in many developing countries, certainly in Turkey, in India, religiosity of various kinds. So it's a Islamic nationalism in Turkey, Hindu nationalism in India, and sometimes Christian evangelical nationalism in Brazil, and so on. So I discussed a lot of those cultural issues. The other cultural issue is nationalism. I have a whole chapter on nationalism. What we have is ethnic nationalism, which is very poisonous in many respects. But I say that there are other kinds of nationalism that liberal those who are liberal Democrats should emphasize. And I call that civic nationalism. And if in the question answer, if anybody wants to know what that is, either you you read my book, or I can briefly answer about civic nationalism, which are nationalism which is based on certain liberal values, sometimes enshrined in the Constitution. The example let me give from a different world, which is the world of soccer or football. Now, if you look at the football teams of many of the European countries, there's a lot of football nationalism, sure, and people are proud of their country's football teams. But once the football team, when they line up, quite often 1/3 to half of the team is not from the majority ethnicity. So it's not, Christian nationalism or Islamic nationalism, etc. There's a great deal of diversity. So you can be proud of your national team, but at the same time, you can celebrate ethnic diversity. So that's an metaphor for civic nationalism. The other thing I just wanted to mention, and then I'll take questions, is on the what to do part, the second half of my book, Rejuvenation of Social Democracy. I emphasize particularly two aspects. One is anti-monopoly policies, which are extremely important because corporate concentration is increasing in most parts of the world, and certainly alarmingly so in major countries of capitalism like the United States. Huge rise in corporate concentration, and it not merely affects economic efficiency, it subverts democracy, because these corporates, for example, the United States, lots lobbying by corporates and election spending by corporates so huge that essentially subverts democracy. The same for developing countries, same in India, for example, there's corporate concentration is increasing in India, but it's also, they dominate the election spending, etc. So it's a subversion of democracy. So we have to do something about anti-monopoly. The other is to increase and this is an aspect of social democracy that to me is very important, increase the importance of labor organizations' voice in corporate governance. And I give the example of Germany. Germany has a long history of labor organizations, labor representation being very important in corporate governance. And this is important for various aspects. One is they can affect the company's policies about outsourcing. They can affect, and this is going to be increasingly important over time, they can affect the company's R&D policies. Why is that important? Because R&Ds decide in which direction of innovation the company is going. And I think at the moment, most companies are going for labor-saving technologies, labor-saving innovations. I think it's very important if labor has more voice, as it has in Germany. In Germany, half of the large companies, half of the governing boards in large companies, labor is represented. And then labor can direct innovations toward labor using, labor empowering innovations. This will be critically important in the next few decades, particularly the coming of AI, artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence, unless we moderate it, is going to go more and more in the capital-intensive, labor-replacing direction, skill-intensive, capital-intensive, labor-replacing direction, and that will be quite an alarming direction for many workers. So the labor representation in the corporate governing boards can influence not just the rate of innovation, but the pattern of innovation, which to me is very important. And of course, labor can also influence the nature of corporate donations, corporate funding of elections, corporate lobbying, which, as I already said, quite often subvert democracy. So let me take a pause here and ask for any question that you may have or the audience may have.
Okay, thank you, Professor. That's been very informative and very to the point. I have two types of questions. The one has to do with the difference between economic and cultural insecurity and how these two are correlated. And if you can see a causality between them, one causing the other. For instance, the economic reality maybe is causing, in the end, this cultural agitation and insecurity. And the second is about the role of labor in the boardroom and in corporate decision making. But we'll come to that second, I think. It's to do with innovation and the way in which this labor participation in corporate governance can be constructive and not obstructive to innovation and development.
Yes, those are very good questions. The first one, yes, sometimes economic insecurity drives cultural insecurity. Quite often, when the job situation is bad, you see that many old prejudices, xenophobia against immigrants, racism against racial minorities, those get stoked up. That certainly happens. But I think it is not just that. If it was that, then you will not have situations in which the economy is doing reasonably well, and yet these passions are very much raging. And I'll give you the example, one from Europe and one from my own country, India. In my own country, in India, in fact, this Hindu Nationalist Party, which is an extreme right-wing party, is very influential in parts of the country which are quite affluent, well, are doing better. Some of the parts of, I mean, some of you may have heard of Bangalore, a state which until very recently was the main dominant party was that, and the same in another, probably one of the industrially most advanced states in India is Gujarat, where this party, and that's where Modi came from. So it is not that economic insecurity is driving cultural insecurity in the form of religion in India. Europe example would be Poland. Poland, if you look at the last, say, 20 years history, Poland has done reasonably well economically. But Catholic nationalism is a very important driving force behind the right-wing party, PIS, in Poland. So yes, in general, yes, economic insecurity quite often stokes cultural insecurity, but there are cases. I think the one there, in my book, the term I used is that cultural and economic insecurity are intertwined. They are together quite often, but it is conceptually possible to distinguish the two. Your question about labor voice in the corporate governance and innovations, that is also a very important question. And in fact, in my chapter where I discuss this, in one of the chapters I discuss this, I cite some empirical evidence. And Germany is the country, because Germany has now a long history of labor representation in the corporate governing boards. So we have a lot of observational evidence. And in a recent paper in Quarterly Journal of Economics, we have also found, we find a paper, in fact, one of the co-authors of that paper is a colleague of mine in Berkeley. They show experimental evidence that even if labor has an important voice in corporate governance, it does not do any negative effect on profitability. And it does not have negative effect on dynamism of capital in the sense of exit, inefficient firms exiting. So we have now evidence that it does not have a negative effect on innovation. But having said that, let me say, it also depends what we mean by innovation. Two things I would mention here. One is that in United States, quite often, the typical form of big innovation is what is called disruptive innovation, or what Schumpeter used to call creative destruction. Incumbent firms disrupted. But that is not the only form of innovation. There is what I call incremental innovation, namely not disrupting the incumbent firm. And this is the main pattern of innovation, by the way, in Germany, is in Japan, South Korea, that the farms is not completely destroyed, but it is because of collaboration with workers. Quite often workers come up with new ideas of how to improve production process. In Japan, this is called the Toyota model of innovation, where many of the innovations came from the workers, from within the farm. Incremental, not like Schumpeter's creative destruction. So you have to keep in mind that there is an alternative kind of innovation that the labor's voice may actually improve. The other is, even in the case of the United States, so-called creative destruction, actual reality is quite different. If you think of these big tech companies, Facebook, or now Meta, Facebook, as quite often, and this is not just true of Facebook, I'm giving an example of Facebook. Facebook, whenever it faced some potential rival, it just acquired it. So these big tech companies, through mergers and acquisition, are gobbling up potential rivals. So this, to me, is muscular entrenchment, not creative destruction. So even in the US case, you don't see creative destruction. The 5 big tech companies continue to gobble up other potential rivals. This is what the European regulators are trying to fight against, the big tech companies becoming bigger through mergers and acquisition. And this goes back to what I was talking about, anti-monopoly policies.
All right, perhaps one last question, and let's have from the audience. It's the following, that you find Germany and Japan quite different in culture and labor relations in some ways. So would you say that this constructiveness in labor's role in corporate governance correlates with a feeling of security in their jobs? So countries which don't lay off people so easily, Japan is lifetime employment, and Germany is not laying off people quickly or easily, right? So this gives labor a buy-in, a stake in the company, and then their role in the governance of the company becomes constructive because they have a stake in it. They have a buy-in in the company. Otherwise, in most other European countries, it's more aggressive because they are alienated. They are not part of the whole business.
No, you're right. And in fact, I would say that my idea of social democracy is consistent with that, because social democracy is a form of social insurance. It insures your jobs, and I mean, up to a point. Of course, Germany, for example, had labor reforms in about 20 years back in order to make labor more flexible. Japan, by the way, also is no longer with lifetime employment. They are also changing that. But compared to United States, yes, labor is more assured of its job security, and that then gives them a stake, as you say. And this is what social democracy is partly about. Social democracy gives some security to workers. And that ultimately, not, if you go to extreme, then labor becomes too lazy in some sense, if there is no chance of losing a job. But up to a point, it can help with the stakeholders then become important in the innovation policies. And in a sense, if the best example is Nordic countries. If you take the Scandinavian countries, which is one of the best compared to others, other countries, best welfare systems, and also Scandinavian countries, if you look at the ranking of countries by global innovation index, Scandinavian countries among the top. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway are among the top countries in global innovations, and these are also countries associated with stakeholder capitalism rather than just shareholder capitalism. In fact, Denmark is a very good example of what we are talking about now. This is called active labor market policy. So in Denmark, yes, you can lose your jobs, yes, but the state takes the responsibility of retraining you for as the market demand changes. The state takes the responsibility of supporting you when you don't have the job, and retraining you, reskilling you, and the other countries have also similar programs. But I'm told Denmark has one of the best programs in whole of Europe, and in fact probably the whole of world, of what is called active labor market policy. These are all examples of stakeholder capitalism, and rather than shareholder capitalism, all involving all the different stakeholders. And labor, of course, is a very important stakeholder, which the US capitalism largely ignores. And it is not an accident that of all the major rich countries, United States is probably one of the most anti-union, anti-trade union, although things are slightly changing right now.
Well, at this point, last question, very quick one. Nico, go ahead, yes.
Very quick question. In the tools for combating erosion of democracy, could we include bottom-up innovation? And I mean giving incentives to promote local innovations for the common good. And when I mean local innovations, I mean at the level of local communities. Thank you.
That's also a very important question. In fact, in my book, chapter 2, the whole chapter is on communities. And I personally think local communities' role is extremely important. And there's a whole chapter on the, and I'd say there's some need for balance. Local communities cannot solve all problems, but local communities have the advantage of what economists of information emphasize. Local communities have local knowledge and local information. They know where the centralized bureaucrat may not know, but they know the reality from a much more ground level. And therefore, and this goes back to what I was talking about, the Toyota model of innovation, namely the workers in the factories gave suggestions of improvement. That's an example to me of local innovation, because it's coming from below rather than from just a research lab, centralized research lab. But also there are limits to that, because there are certain things which require more kind of centralized, for example, local community, which has a lot of information about what is good for them, may not have. There are two problems I mentioned. One is that you need sometimes a supra-local infrastructure. You need supra-local. So for example, the most recently, the pandemic. You cannot depend on the local community to come out with the vaccinations. The vaccinations came from, in fact, in many countries, it came from abroad. Vaccinations were done by certain innovations, the new the vaccinations that came up. The local communities could not come up with it. So there are limits to that. The other limit that I should mention, that local, and this also I discussed in my chapter, is that local communities sometimes can be oppressive in terms of oppressing the local minorities. This is an example, for example, in the United States, in the U.S. South, that's where the African Americans, many of them went away from the South because they were feeling oppressed in the South. So if there is unequal situation, both social and economic inequality, that is not good. That local community may not be good enough for doing innovations that will help everybody. So local communities, I think, are very important from the point of view of utilizing local talent and local information. But local communities have some limits, the two kinds of limits but I just mentioned, but there are other kinds. So my whole chapter on community discusses this.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our meeting. It's been a pleasure having you with us, Professor Bardhan. Have a good day. It's morning over there to you. It's evening to us
yes,
here.
Very early morning.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Bye-bye now.
Bye.